Assalamu alaikum, you guys, to everyone who are watching us here in the História Islâmica page in Brazil. We are delighted today to receive our guest, Professor Jonathan AC Brown, to talk about a subject that many of you have been asking from, since the beginning of our page 10 years ago. So we are right now with a specialist on Islamic history and Islamic studies who have been writing from those subjects from since decades from now. So Professor Jonathan AC Brown is someone who have contributed to the development of the Islamic studies in the United States of America. And so we are now presenting him to a Brazilian audience on a subject that is very relevant in our country. That is the history of slavery. Because Brazil, like United States of America, was actually a country built on the basis of slave labor and enslaved labor that brought right here from Africa. So we have a very mixed race society here in Brazil. For example, I'm from Black heritage and also Portuguese heritage. So the majority of the people here in Brazil have been, their families have been actually on both sides of the society spectrum in what relates to this experience. So today I'm here with Professor Jonathan AC Brown. Professor, welcome. And my first question to you, I have read in your book, Islam and Slavery, is a very fascinating narrative and construction of the history of slavery in Islam. And what made me, very fond about the book is the people actually don't know and they can't define what slavery is. Because if you compare, like you did in your book, the life of a Ottoman officer, like a Grand Vizier, who is called in the popular culture and the popular writing of history, like a slave, and someone who come all the way from Guinea to the plantation system in South United States, and they are both called on the same name, but there is no actually a equivalence on the both situation. How can we define slavery and the work of the historian on defining slavery?
Okay, well, assalamu alaikum, everybody, and thanks very much for inviting me. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. It's really an honor to know that my work is of use to people. These questions, I wrote this book in a lot of ways, to answer these questions myself and to help out audiences who have precisely these questions. I would say that there's the fundamental question in the academic study of slavery and world history, and that is, how do you define slavery? Which is kind of a bizarre, it's kind of weird, right? Because you have a field that's studying something, but then it's sort of trying to figure out what that thing actually is that it's studying. And you can imagine what that means is that if you don't really know exactly what you're studying, then you don't know exactly what goes into that study or what's outside that study. This is not a big problem. For example, the study of religion in the Western Academy, there's no agreed upon definition of religion. Somebody might think that Brazilian football is a type of religion, things like that, right? But that's fine. The difference is with slavery is that if something is slavery, then it is morally evil in modern Western discourse. Versus if it's not slavery, then it can be discussed. Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, maybe it's okay. But when you label something as slavery, it becomes morally condemned. So the problem with a field that doesn't really have a agreed upon consistent definition for slavery in world history is that you have a risk of going around throughout world history and sort of stamping things with moral condemnation when those things might actually not be very similar to one another. So I think that's the main issue we have here. There's been a couple of, now, again, we also have to be clear here, right? So if we want to say define slavery in the Americas, that's very easy to do. So slavery in the kind of 1400s to 19th century in America. Okay, that's relatively easy. It's one European tradition, Roman law tradition, Christianity, et cetera, et cetera. You have indigenous people in America. You have Africans who are brought. It's a very contained conversation. That's not too difficult. If you want to talk about, let's say, slavery in Islamic civilization, you have the Sharia, you have kind of the traditions of Christianity and Roman law and Judaism feeding into this. Okay, again, relatively contained discussion. The problem happens when you try and talk about slavery throughout history, right? So what happens with, and what I argue in my book is that when Western scholars talk about slavery throughout history and throughout the world, what they're basically doing is taking what they recognize as slavery from the Western European Atlantic tradition, and then going around the world and looking for things that look like that, and then calling that slavery, and then stamping it with that mark of evil. The problem is, though, right, that how do they actually define slavery? They would say, for example, there's a couple of different definitions. One is kind of slavery is when someone is property. One might also say slavery is when someone's not free. One might also say slavery is when someone is in a position of compulsion, where they're compelled or they're coerced to do something. They're coerced to work for little repayment under the threat of violence. The problem with these concepts are that they're very abstract, right? So what does it mean to be property? Property just means, again, in the Western legal tradition, you might have a pretty good idea of what it means to be property. But if you want to go throughout human history and say, what does property mean? It basically means somebody has right to something. But I mean, that could mean lots of different things, right? So, for example, in medieval and even early modern China, people would like leave, and when they were writing their will, they would write in the will, I leave my wife to so and so, some person, right? So does that mean your wife is property because you're leaving her in your will? I mean, there's a lot of questions that come up in world history about what exactly property is. Same thing if you want to talk about freedom. What is freedom? I mean, freedom is, the ability to do what you want, except what you're not allowed to do. But that's like, I mean, so what's the difference between a slave and a free person? Is a free person can do what they want, except what they're not allowed to do. And a slave can do what they want, except what they're not allowed to do by their master, right? So where exactly the line is between free and slave in terms of what freedom they have is going to differ depending on place and time and context. So it becomes really hard to define in world history what slavery is. So the problem is that what you have is kind of, especially Western scholars, saying that anytime somebody is not free, anytime somebody is property, anytime somebody exists under coercion, in a coerced labor situation, they're a slave. The problem is that it's very difficult to consistently apply these in world history. So, for example, if you say that, anytime someone is being coerced to work, well, most people in human history are coerced to work. I mean, if you go, a lot of the, for example, new abolitionist definitions, when people talk about how like workers in the Gulf and then in Qatar or Saudi Arabia or places are slaves, if you take that definition, okay, you can have that definition if you want to call that slavery. But if you take that and you project it backward in history, I mean, not only the slaves are in Brazil would be slaves, but also the workers and the owners and the wives of the owners of the plantations would also be slaves. So like these definitions, if you project them backward in time, they end up sucking up lots of people that we would not want to go back in time and say they are slaves. We would think of them as free. Similarly, if you say that, anybody is slavery is when someone's property or not free, then, as you said before, the whole senior administration of the Ottoman Empire in the 1500s and 1600s were slaves. They were property of the Sultan. They were not free. They were officially slaves under the Sharia, but they were the most powerful people in the empire, except for the Sultan. They were rich. They were powerful. They married the daughters of the Sultan, and they got their cousins jobs and their kids jobs, and their kids became the Grand Vizier and their cousins became the Grand Vizier, and they made their cousins, the patriarch of this church or that church. So to say that person who's like one of the rulers in the empire is in a situation of moral evil, similar to somebody who's working on a sugar plantation in Brazil in 1700 and being whipped, and their babies are taken away from them and they die and they're just thrown into the water in the garbage. I mean, to say these two things are similar, that's just not accurate, right? But if you just say anytime slavery is someone being unfree or property, you end up unable to distinguish between these two conditions. So the argument I make in and just for those of you who are looking for some kind of summary on this, right, is that we have to be very careful, because the way we talk about slavery today, we think of it as this kind of transhistorical moral evil, and every time something is labeled as slavery, it's evil. But what we end up doing then is taking a lot of different relationships, some which are not nearly as bad as others, and some are which are not bad at all, probably, and labeling them all according to our judgment about slavery in the Americas, like in Brazil or the United States, which we justifiably condemn. But it's not really accurate to characterize lots of other examples of this, of different relationships in human history, and say that they're the same, either morally or even in terms of their other features, as what we saw in the Americas.
Yeah, and I doubt that even many people that are in the field of Islamic studies, they start to have is uh, when did slavery in Islam begin? Because some even Muslims apologetics, they try to portray the image that Islam came and abolished slavery at any forms, and because it's a moral evil, and if it is a moral evil and it's allowed in the Islamic law, in the Sharia law, so it's automatically something that is evil and it's allowed by religion. So what is the difference between the many and various forms of slavery, and when did the slavery begin in the history of Islam and Islamic civilization? Did it started with the Prophet? And for example, many people, they cannot divide when something is called Islamic slavery or Arab slave trade, and the other form of slavery that have been existed in previous time on those lands. For example, we have the Arab slave trade in Egypt, but slavery never ended in Egypt before Islam. And when you can call it Islamic slavery, just because the people started to speak Arabic or they converted to Islam, or for example, the Visigoths, the Visigoths, they were a kingdom based upon slavery. They brought many Slavs from Northern Europe and other areas of Russia to work on the fields on the Visigothic kingdom. So when did the slavery that was practiced there on the Iberian Peninsula suddenly turned to Islamic slavery? So this is the questions: when did it begin, and when we started to call something Islamic slavery?
Yeah. Okay, so it's a very important thing to remember is that so all civilizations that we know of. So having just talked about the problems of defining slavery, we could roughly say that sort of this situation, things that we think about as slavery, somebody being subordinated to another person, somebody having like dramatically less rights than another person under their control, something like that, right? We'll just call this slavery. So every civilization in world history, and most societies in world history have had slaves. And no society that had slaves, which again are most societies and every civilization in human history, none of these ever suggested or even considered the possibility of abolishing slavery until the 1700s, right? And really until the late 1700s, and really until kind of the 1800s, right? So this is really important to keep this in mind, because a lot of times there's this idea that, you know, Muslims, it never occurred to them to abolish slavery. And then the Europeans, they became enlightened and they realized slavery was wrong and they abolished slavery. And then they kind of went around the world and tried to convince other people to be moral too. And eventually Muslims were like, okay, we'll be moral as well. We'll get rid of slavery. This is a very inaccurate, very, very inaccurate narrative. I mean, first of all, as I said before, think about this. No society that had slaves thought about abolishing slavery until the 1700s. What else is happening in the 1700s? In Britain, and in the British territories, northern British colonies of America, which became the United States. What happened there before anywhere else in the world? Industrialization. Not only industrialization, but enormous wealth developed by industrialization in a way that didn't require slaves. In fact, it required workers, right? Free workers. So the two places in the world, Great Britain and British colonies in North America, the first places in the world that discovered you can take coal, you can burn it, you can use steam to move things instead of having people move things, instead of having animals move things. These two places are the people who first talked about getting rid of slavery as an institution. That's not a coincidence, right? That's not a coincidence. Humans before hadn't done this. No one had, it had not occurred to anybody. It would be like saying, if you went back to the 1200 or 500 AD and said, let's get rid of slavery, it would be like being like, let's get rid of like school or something. It wouldn't make sense. I mean, think about this. Imagine in like 100 years, if we have AI and you don't need to memorize things anymore because you have like an AI device in your mind, which immediately, like, it's like a Siri in your mind, right? Anytime you remember something, it just draws it from the internet or something, right? And we'll look back and be like, huh, it's so weird that people had like school and they memorized things. But imagine for us, it's inconceivable to imagine a world where learning doesn't involve memorization of things, right? So that's I think really important to keep in mind, because people didn't really conceive of the possibility of not having slavery. As Aristotle actually says in his book on politics, he has an extremely prescient statement. He says, there will be slaves until looms. Looms are like the things that minwal in Arabic. It's like when you weave cloth on a loom. It's like you see these things. It's like this big machine for weaving. He says, until these move themselves, there'll be slaves, which actually is what happened right now. Then when you start having looms that move themselves, then you don't need slaves anymore. So I think it's very important because it really takes a lot of this sort of the question of enlightenment or moral awakening. It just kind of takes us out of the equation and really doesn't start. We stop kind of blaming people for not being the first to abolish slavery and giving people rewards, plaudits or pats on the back for being the first to do this. I think that's not really accurate. Okay, so then the other question is about Islamic slavery. Okay, so the Mediterranean and kind of Near Eastern world into which Islam comes is a world in which slavery is a very important part of the economy in places like the Roman Empire and Persia, cities like Rome in the first century CE. About 1/3 of the population of Rome is the city itself is slaves. So slaves are a big part of the Roman economy. When you look at places like Arabia at the time of the Prophet, slavery was much less important. There were slaves everywhere, but there were not that many of them, and they were not really a big part of the society. They were not really economically essential like they were in Brazil or the United States. They were like people that would help you, kind of like servants, right? And mostly they were captured in raids, and mostly they were actually others. The biggest group of slaves in Arabia at the time of the Prophet were actually other Arabs. And then the second largest group would be Ethiopians. And then the third largest group, probably Persians. Again, people mostly captured on raids were bought from slave dealers, but they were not really that important in the economy. Okay, so when Islam comes, the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet make certain very dramatic changes to the institution of slavery that exists in Arabia, and then as Islam spreads out in the Muslim, the area controlled by Muslims. One is that it gets rid of the Quran and the Sunnah get rid of debt slavery. So debt slavery was in world history probably the main route into slavery. I borrow money, I can't pay back the person I owe money to, so I have become the slave of that person. And most times, my work for that person is not to pay the debt, it's to pay the interest on the debt. In fact, it's very hard to get out of that because I can't really work to pay back the initial debt. I'm always working just to pay the interest on the debt. So Islam gets rid of debt slavery. Islam gets rid of what's called self-dedition, giving yourself into slavery. People might say that doesn't make sense. Why would someone give themselves into slavery? Well, imagine, I always think it's useful to think about these shows like The Last of Us or like zombie apocalypse, Mad Max type movies. Imagine if there's like, you're in a Mad Max situation, you're wandering around the wilderness, you're terrified, you don't have any money, you're trying to take care of your kids. You suddenly come across this city with walls and it's safe. And you say, let me in, please, please let me in. They say, okay, you can come in, but you're going to be our slave. You'd say, okay, no problem, no problem. Just let me in. Right. So, um, we value freedom, of course, but freedom really is only valuable if you have basic security. And so a lot of times in human history, whether it's medieval Europe or the ancient kingdom of Israel or ancient Near East, people would give themselves into slavery. They would give their children into slavery. So Islam prohibits that as well. In fact, the only way that you can become a slave in Islamic law is by being a non-Muslim outside the Muslim state who's captured in warfare. Or Muslims can just buy a slave from somebody else. But if you to become a slave, you're a non-Muslim outside the abode of Islam, captured in warfare. So one of the things that the Quran and the Sunnah do is that they restrict the ways into slavery to this one route, which is capture of non-Muslims outside the abode of Islam. Then the second thing that they do, that the Quran and the Sunnah do, is that they create enormous incentives to free slaves. And this might seem obvious to people that freeing slaves is good, but in fact, this is not obvious, right, in world history. If you look at other texts, ancient texts like the Bible or Roman law or something, they might have occasional encouragement to manumit slaves or to free slaves. But the Quran is quite obsessive about this, and it brings it up numerous times. It ties it to not only it's a deed done by believers, but it's also a deed you have to do if you commit certain sins, if you break certain oaths, if you kill someone accidentally, in addition to paying the person's family and compensating for them for the death, you also have to free a slave. So there's a lot of freeing slaves is tied to the expiation of sins. And the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ makes it extremely clear the rewards you receive for freeing slaves. So, in fact, if you look at the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet, or just the Quran, or just the Sunnah of the Prophet, or together, I don't know of any texts that are so obsessed with emancipation that make clear the impetus for emancipation. And so there's this, one could say, well, why don't they ban slavery? As I said before, banning slavery was really not conceivable until the period of industrialization. Okay. Finally, I would say that another feature of slavery under Islamic civilization is that instead of having male slave owners having sex with their female slaves, and then the child is illegitimate, or the child is a slave, or illegitimate and a slave, right? And kind of excluded from the family or whatever. In Islamic law, from the very beginning, if a male has a child with his female slave, one, he can't sell the female slave after that. Two, the female slave becomes free after he dies. And three, most importantly, the child born of that union is a free Muslim in good social standing. So that person is the same standing as someone born of the free wife. And so you look at, for example, the Abbasid caliphs. Most of the Abbasid caliphs they're born from slave women. And almost all the Ottoman sultans, I think maybe except one or two, almost all the Ottoman sultans are actually also born of slave women. So unlike, let's say, in America, like Thomas Jefferson, the third president, he had children with his female slave, and those children were slaves, and they were considered black, and they were considered a lower class people who were never going to be part of the elite in the United States. Eventually, he freed them. But if Thomas Jefferson were Muslim and America were a Muslim society at that time, his children would be like the children of, like, for example, John Adams, the second president of the United States. His child, John Quincy Adams, became the president later on. So you could have had Thomas Jefferson's child born from his slave woman, who looks like a mixture between an English guy and some kind of African person, right? So maybe he has darker skin. That person could have been the president as well, right? So that's a big difference between Islamic slavery and slavery in other parts of the world. Obviously, there's a lot of diversity of slavery in Islamic civilization, because Islamic civilization is a very big place over many centuries. But I'd say that there are a few characteristics that you can find pretty much everywhere. One is this extreme encouragement to free slaves, almost obsession with freeing slaves. So even if you have a slave, you'll always be freeing them. Maybe you'd buy another one, but you'd constantly be freeing them, right? And the second one is that the child born of a union between a slave woman and her owner is free and in good social standing. And the third is that what this creates is what the famous African historian Ali Mazrui called ascending miscegenation. Ascending miscegenation. So whereas in the US, like with Thomas Jefferson, if you have a child between a white slave owner and his black slave, that child is going to go down into the slave population and into the black population. So it's not white and it's not free. Whereas in Islamic civilization, the child born of that union would go up into the free population and the kind of socially recognized, unproblematic, right? So there's not, the way you look doesn't determine what your standing is. Because if, let's say, you're walking down the streets of Cairo in 1500 and you see a guy who has really dark skin, that could be a slave, or it could be the son of the ruler of the country with his black female slaves, and the guy is like one of the most powerful people in the country. So what it means is that there's not really a and sometimes people ask, like, well, why isn't there an abolition movement in Islamic civilization like there was in in Brazil or in the United States or anything like that amongst the slave population? Why wasn't there kind of a lot of slave rebellions like in Bahia or in Jamaica or other places? And I think the reason is that people didn't really feel why do slaves rebel, right? They rebel, one, if they're being treated really terribly. Two, they rebel if there's a lot of them and they're together, like in a plantation situation, right? So there's a lot of them. There's not that many white people. Once you kind of overpower those white people, you actually might have success in rebellion. And third, you have to have no hope, right? This has to be the option of this rebellion or fleeing has to be better than anything else you can hope for. Whereas in Islamic civilization in general, you did not have these big plantations. Slaves were mostly used for like domestic work. Like, imagine you have a maid in your house, that person's a slave. Maybe you have two, and then they're not all in one place. I'd say in general, this is a big generalization, but I'd say in general, they were in Islamic civilization, you did not have severe treatment as severe as you had in the Caribbean and the Americas in the 1500s to the 1800s, which is really, really, really sort of unprecedented violence. We can talk more about that if you want. And third, if you were a slave in Islamic civilization, you had a really good chance of being freed in a few years. And after that, you weren't going to be like a black person who people treated badly, or a black person who someone tried to enslave after that. You were a person who was like anyone else, who looked like a lot of other people around you and could go and become a businessman or whatever you wanted to do, or be married and have a family and things. So there wasn't as much of a kind of the incentives and for these kind of rebellions, or to have like an indigenous abolitionist movement.
Yeah, and this is amazing. One term that you have used that made me, amazed me, was ascending miscegenation, because here in Brazil, everyone is mixed race basically. Despite the image that the people have, oh, in Brazil the majority of the population is black or maybe it's white. No, we Brazilians, we have mixed heritage. For example, in a family, you can be black, Jew, and Native American. So it is a very, very common feature here in Brazil. But this idea of ascending through miscegenation is a very, a unique feature in Islamic, like, how can we say it, slave experience. So this is tied to the idea of you being born of a mother that come from a slave origin, or even a father, because we have the Delhi Sultanate and even Ottoman Empire, where the Sultan married his daughter to actually a slave man. So through this miscegenation, you can be born in ascension, and well, and many people, even in polemics that they write about Islam, they talk every time about the sexual slavery that a woman in this world of Islamic slavery, there is this thing called sexual slavery, that the slavery is bound to sexuality. This is something real or is made up or is a misinterpretation? How can we explain this to the audience, Professor?
Okay, so I mean, in world history in general, and this is quite well established by scholarship, slaves were always vulnerable. I mean, generally vulnerable, right? So if you're a woman, you're going to be vulnerable, kind of sexually vulnerable to your male owner or males in the family who control you. Um, so that was pretty unsurprising, right? And the idea that a female slave was kind of maybe not legally, but no one was really going to stop the owner or the owner's son or the owner's brother or whatever from having sex with her. They were in a position of vulnerability. This is pretty well established in world history that this is a feature of just generally this kind of relationships. Um, and what the difference between Islamic law and kind of the practice in Islamic civilization and most other places, as far as I know, is that um, one, it was very clear who was allowed to have sex with this person. So you can't have a man cannot have sex with his brother's slave or his son's slave or his wife's slave, right? He could have sex with his own slave only. That's it, right? So anything else not allowed. Second, um, the second the man has sex with that slave, the woman becomes his slave concubine, his suriya, and if she even has a miscarriage, she gets pregnant and has a miscarriage, let's say, even 3 months into pregnancy, she's walad, which means she can't be sold and she'll be free when he dies. And if she has a child, the child is free, etc. So you have this very clear lines about what's allowed and what's not allowed. And instead of pretending these relationships don't happen, which is kind of what happened in the Americas, right, or certainly the United States, which is what becomes the United States, or even in Roman law or Jewish law prior to Islam, was that you just sort of we're not supposed to happen. No, we would never do this. Of course, it's happening constantly, and the children born of these relationships are just going down into the slave population, or maybe they kind of that later on they get acknowledged and freed, but they're also free black people or whatever. So, um, uh, what happens is that in Islamic law, this relationship is structured, and the children born of this relationship are free, and they're this treated the same as children born of regular relationships. So I think that's an important feature I already discussed. But some people might say, well, how does why does Islamic law acknowledge the legitimacy of sex with slaves or for female slaves? And that's a kind of a moral objection one hears a lot, and it's understandable moral objection. I think um, the answer to that is that um, it was just given the social reality and legal reality of slavery in world history, uh, the possibility of the owner having sex with his female slave was like very high, and it was either going to be legal or illegal. Either it was going to be kind of protected or not protected. I think that's the answer the Sharia took was to make it legal and to then structure it and protect the child born from that union. What's interesting is the Christians and Jews who are interacting with Muslims from the very early period, from this 700s into the medieval Muslim period, right? They actually don't allow sex with slave women. They don't allow it. The children born of these are not legitimate, and they're not free. at least not automatically. Um, and this is actually something that they will criticize Muslims for, which is interesting. Uh, but you can see kind of you can see, maybe compare the results, right? So on the one hand, you have, let's say, Christian and Jewish traditions, which are not allowing this. They say it's not allowed. We don't accept it. Of course, it happens anyway, but you don't have a way to deal with the children or protect the female slave. Whereas in Islamic civilization, it says, look, this is going to happen. So let's have the woman become someone you can't sell, who becomes free when you die, and the child is legitimate and free. And so the answer was, and so in the end, in Islamic civilization, you get lots of great scholars, lots of great poets, lots of rulers are the results, the products of these relationships between owners and their female slaves. Whereas if those had been Christian or Jewish societies, even in the Muslim world, uh, those children would not have been free and they would not have been legitimate.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing to look at, because every time the subject of Islamic slavery is covered in myth and like I will say bigotry from projection, a Freudian way of look at things, like projecting the experience that we have on South America, on Europe, into the Muslim world. But a special feature on Islamic civilization and its experience with slavery is, um, really, did any Muslim thinker, theologian, or any other person of intellect inside of Islamic civilization never thought about the end of slavery, or like the in abolition movement? Because here in Brazil, we have a very famous guy. His name is Luis Gama. He was a son of a Muslim woman, enslaved Muslim women from African origin, and his father was a slave owner. So when he was a child, his father sold him into the slave market. So he was sold, and some historians even say that this was a something that contributed to his mother participated in the slave revolt on Bahia, the famous Revolta dos Malês that happened here in Brazil. His mother was she acted like an agent, sending a message in Arabic to people to plan the revolt. Her name was Luisa Mahin. So when he grew up as a defender of the African people here in Brazil, a abolitionist, a very famous abolitionist here inside of the country. So really, inside of the whole Islamic land since the beginning of Islam in 7th century Arabia, did never this occur to any scholar to abolish slavery at all, or not?
No, but I think you have to look at kind of what the Bahia Rebellion was 1835, was it?
Yeah, it is in the 1835. Yeah,
Okay, if I hope I'm correct. I can't remember
yeah,
exactly. I mean, you have to think about what's happened by that time. I mean, you have a place like Brazil. I mean, if you look, you can see a map where it shows you in fast motion every single slave ship that goes from Africa to the Americas from, 1500 to 18 something, right? And the vast majority go to Brazil and the Caribbean. I mean, North America was like a sideshow compared to Brazil, which was really the core, the most populated by slaves. And slavery continues there the longest until 1880s, right? So you have the huge population of people who are brought from Africa, right? Oftentimes they can find people of the same ethnic group and the same religion. And there are a huge number of them. There's relatively few white people who are owning them or overseeing them. And they're being treated terribly. So this is a really important factor, which is that the violence of the Atlantic slave trade, not only the actual trade across the ocean, but the treatment in the Caribbean and South America and places that are an extension of that, like South Carolina, is absolutely shocking. I don't mean it's shocking to us. It is. It was shocking to people at the time. So the people who start to write against the non-slaves, like the white people, or who start to protest against slavery in the late 1600s, 1689, 1690, early 1700s, these are all people who have direct experience with the slave trade. They're shocked, absolutely shocked. I mean, this stuff, if you read, there's this one slave overseer, later plantation owner in Jamaica, who actually kept a journal, thousands of pages of journal. What he did to slaves and wrote about is absolutely shocking. Absolutely shocking. I mean, and I'm saying this as a guy, I'm pretty cynical guy. I don't really get surprised. I was shocked. I mean, they had devices, special devices to hold the slave's mouth open so you could put feces, human feces, into their mouth. I mean, it's unbelievable. Unbelievable. And they did this because they were trying to instill absolute terror in the slave population, because there were so many slaves and so few white people overseeing them. The white people were terrified. The only way they could assure the obedience of these slaves was to brutalize them. You go to the actual slave trade, the transatlantic, the Middle Passage, they were dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of mutinies, of rebellions by the slaves on the ships. The ships themselves were specially constructed to have internal defenses against mutiny. It was violence from the beginning to the end. It was unprecedented violence. I've never seen anything like this in Islamic history. You have a few rebellions like the Zand revolt in the 800s, here and there, but just the level of violence in the trade, in the actual movement of slaves to the market, and in the treatment, I've never seen anything that approximates or that approaches the Middle Passage and the cruelty of slavery in the especially Caribbean and South America. So I think that's why, and again, this guy, Will, what was his name?
Luis Gama.
Luis Gama, right? So, and then he identifies himself with this population that's identifiable. There's no, I mean, if you go to like Cairo in 1700, or let's say Cairo in 1830 at his time, or Mecca in 1830. I mean, there's no real population that you can identify with. I mean, there's slaves in Cairo, obviously, probably about 5 to 15% of the population was slaves in Cairo or in Mecca at the time, in the Hijaz. But they were, okay, you had slaves from all over. You had African slaves, you had Indian slaves. Who were other slaves? The mothers of all the elites are Circassian slave women or Greek slave women. So the mothers of the elite are slaves. So it's sort of, instead of one group of people who are these oppressed, exploited laborers who are racially identifiable, you have lots of different races at different levels in the society that are not concentrated in one way where they're being exploited altogether, right? Some slave owners might have treated like their slaves like garbage in Cairo or in Mecca, but they weren't in a position where they could group together and have a rebellion, and then, or even be a group that someone would kind of lobby on behalf, right? There was just there wasn't that sense of shared identity. So I think that's a big difference, to the point where some people say, like, what should we do, reparations for slaves in Islamic civilization? And I say, kind of, I mean, sort of as a joke, but I think it's also a good point, which is, if you want to be able to identify descendants of slaves in, let's say, Egypt, go to the richest people in Egypt, the ones who are the lightest skin, give them money, because their grandmothers for multiple generations were Circassian or Turkic or Greek slave women. That's how they look like that. I mean, that they're the elite. So you want to give them money, you can go ahead. But I mean, so my point is, it's very different very different situation than you have in the Americas, where it's very easy. In the US, you can easily tell who's the descendants of slaves.
Yeah.
Easily, right? You can date just with your eyes. And that would be accurate. I mean, unless somebody guy's like, hey, I'm from Nigeria, I just moved here. But like everyone else, one of their ancestors was a slave at least.
Yeah.
So these two situations are not comparable. And I think one of the problems is that people who are concerned about racial justice or equity or reparations, these are fine, laudable concerns. I support these agenda. But if you take these in the Americas and then you go and you try and sort of just replicate them everywhere else in the world, it doesn't work because people have very different histories that differ greatly from the American tradition of slavery.
Yeah, it is indeed a very big feature. And I was reading a book published by a Senegalese historian. His name was Tidiane Nidiane. He wrote a book called in French Le Génocide Voilé, the Veiled Genocide, where he said that Islamic slavery was greater in number to anything that Europeans have done. And I don't know how he came about with this calculation, because the enslavement of African people it never stopped, even after the fall of the Roman Empire, because Vandals kept coming to North Africa, and then the medieval kingdoms of Spain also kept coming to North Africa to capture slaves. Vikings kept coming to North Africa. But he told this. And the main argument that he and other people have been presenting is that the reason that you didn't find thousands or dozens of black descendant people in Middle East today is because every single man that was brought to the Arabic speaking world was castrated.
Yeah, because this is ridiculous. I mean, these statements are insane. I mean, first of all, there's a lot to address there, but I mean, first of all, in Islamic civilization, slaves came from 3 or 4 main groups, right? And kind of in order, it's basically Persians and Turks, Slavs, and probably that's the majority. The majority is together kind of Persians, Turks, and Slavs, and then Africans, so Africans from south of Sahara, and also Indians, right? So those are the main populations. So if we just talk about, slavery in Africa, there's a lot of questions we have to start answering, right? So first of all, what is Africa? Like, if I take a slave I capture someone in what's today, let's say Nigeria, and I take them to Marrakesh in Morocco, am I taking them out of Africa, or is that still in Africa? So, I mean, first of all, there's a lot of questions about how we define Africa. Do we say real Africa is sub-Saharan Africa? Okay, let's just say when we talk about slavery in Africa, we're talking about Black Africans, people that we would today racialize as Black, being taken out of there to somewhere else. We don't know. Maybe it's North Africa, maybe it's somewhere else. Okay, let's say we're talking about that. It's very hard to calculate numbers, but I'd say, based on my estimates, and this is a real generalization, somewhere between 12 and 15 million people were taken from 700 to about, let's say, 1850. Taken out of what we just called Africa to somewhere else. Okay. So from 700 to 1850, about 12 to 15 million. The European slave trade, and when I talked about roughly 1500 to roughly 1850, right? They have the transatlantic slavery database says that it's between 10 and 12 million. So between 10 and 12 million people over a period of 3 centuries, 3.5 centuries. So we talked about before is in Islamic history, let's say about 11 or 12 centuries, you have 12 to 15 million. in the transatlantic European slave trade, you have 10 to 12 million in 3.5 centuries. So I think maybe 4 times more intensive. And also based on racialization, based on notions of cultural superiority and resulting in colonialism and all sorts of other stuff. Okay. Now we have to, if you wanted to say that, Muslims took more slaves out of Africa than Europeans, maybe they did, but it's also, they did so over many more centuries. So it's like 3 to 4 times less intense. Second point, which is, and this is a point you made very well, which is, why did when we talk about European slavery, why are we saying 1500 to 1800? I mean, Romans were buying slaves from Egypt, from Nubia or Ethiopia in 0 BC. We love to talk about Westerners. We talk about Rome as part of Western civilization. Go downtown Washington, D.C., all the buildings look like Roman temples. So we love to claim the accomplishments of Roman civilization, but why not? Why don't we accept the negative deeds as well? Right. Yeah. So why don't we talk about the European slave trade over 2,000 years?
Yep.
As opposed to just 3.5 centuries. So we don't know the actual numbers. The third question, real question this brings up is, where are the boundaries of all this? I mean, a lot of the quote unquote Muslims or Arabs who are engaged in the slave trade in Africa are, one, they're black, right? We would see them today, we'd say they're black. They would look at themselves and say they're black. Okay. Their grandfather might be Arab or Persian or something, but they're born in Zanzibar. They look like everybody else. Okay. Second, they're going inland, and like Europeans, I'm not trying to remove any moral blame from Europeans, but the fact is, it's not like European slave traders, Portuguese slave traders, were going inland in West Africa and doing raids. They didn't want to do that kind of stuff. They would buy, everyone knows, they would go buy stuff from other Africans, right? So similarly, these Muslim slave traders, they're not, sometimes they're doing raids, but a lot of times they're just going and buying slaves from people who are selling their own people or someone else that they raided from other African groups. So if we're going to talk about, who's involved in this slave trade, we all know that this is involving as well people who are inside this thing we're calling Africa. So I think that in both the case of European slave trade and the quote unquote Muslim slave trade. So I think a lot of these, when you take all these points together, it shows you how much, how complicated these questions are, and how really, when we're talking about them, what we're really talking about is people who are like, fans of Western civilization, they're Western supremacists or something like that, saying, yeah, we did slavery, but we're not that bad. We're not as bad as the Muslims. And plus, we're sorry. We apologize. We realize it was wrong, whereas the Muslims never did. Right. So that's what it's not about numbers or people suffering or reality and history or really understanding any of these things. It's just about being able to feel a sense of superiority, moral superiority today. I think that's very important.
Yeah. Yeah. And also a last question. In my own country, in our own history, we have a very graphic feature of slavery, that is punishment. Like, for example, sometimes I read on magazines, on news and stuff, that on Indonesia, someone was caught doing something like a sexual offense or crime, and such a person was lashed. And the people think about someone hanging from like 2 meters and someone whipping him with a Indiana Jones whip, very big, and the person is screaming and blood come. And when it's actually something that is even less severe that Brazilian mothers do to the children inside homes. And this idea of lashes, of punishment, really have a very big impact on the mind of Brazilian people, because we have experienced slavery here. We have people on camera that have died in the 90s that were actually slaves, and they talk about slavery when they were in their 20s, that they were actually slave, beaten and everything. So in Islamic civilization, and especially on Islamic law, where do the beating and the punishment for in the slavery enter? And it's the master allowed to do when slavery was practiced. Is the master allowed to do anything with the slave, and beating and cutting maybe his hand or something for a bad deed, like something like that?
Yeah.
It's just allowed in Islamic law, something like
Yeah,
that.
I mean, I think, well, first of all, right, Islamic civilization is very broad, you know, very broad phenomenon over many centuries. So it's, you have to think that there is all sorts of possibilities for what actually happened. Some owners were probably really brutal. Some owners are probably very fair or very, kind. So you just have to keep in mind that there's going to be a lot of variety. Uh, Certainly in Islamic history, generally, that when they talk about whipping or lashing, they're usually referring to it's almost like you know what a riding crop is? I don't know if I don't think I have one here. I have a lot of horse
Hmm.
stuff. It's like it's like a stick like this long, or like this long, and it sort of bends, and you whack. You can hit like a horse with it, right? So
Yeah,
it hurts. It'll hurt if you get hit with it. It's going to hurt a lot.
yeah.
But it's not like the, cat of nine tails you see in the, British ships, or the kind of 12 years a slave whip. And, you also have to think about what's going on here. And I mean, generally, slave owners, their slaves are their property, and they want that property to be productive. They don't have, if you may want to punish somebody or make an example, but you don't want to injure your slave, because that slave might die very easily of infection or something. So, I mean, uh, the lash are generally this, like, it's called the sot, which is like a kind of a riding crop, right? Just as an example, okay, so in Islamic law, the rule would be generally that you could discipline your slave in a way that was reasonable and similar to how you would discipline your child. Um, eh, so the slave and the child are essentially at the same level of they're both kind of under your control, you're dependent, and you could discipline them. But if you did something, you caused injury, you caused serious injury, you broke their skin, you broke a bone, you caused really serious injury to your child or your slave, uh, they could and they did. We have lots of examples of this. Take the owner to court and say, you want to be freed, you want to be compensated for the injury. This is we have lots of examples of this in Islamic history. Um, so, and then if you did something like you cut off the slave's ear, you cut their nose off, you castrate, the things like that, the slave would be freed automatically. Like the judge or whoever was in charge of the legal system would free that slave, because that was the responsibility of the government to oversee the care of slaves like this. And this goes back to the Sunnah of the Prophet, alayhi salam, and the early Muslim community. So, and just as an example, like in this one, I think 4th century Greek preacher, Gregory Nazianzus, and I think also John Chrysostom, if I'm not mistaken, these two famous Greek Byzantine preachers, they were talking about, don't treat your slaves badly, don't lash them more than 30 or 40 times. So that number, just an example, that was the maximum, like in the Hanafi school of law, which is very widespread school of law. That was like the maximum punishment even a judge could give to somebody, was like 30 or 40 lashes. So you could imagine that, these Byzantine preachers urging their flocks to treat their slaves beneficently were saying, don't go over 30 or 40 lashes. that was the maximum that you would get, even if you were a criminal being punished in a like a Hanafi court, for example. So I think that gives you a sense of that, in general, the use of corporal punishment in the Islamic legal system and what was considered reasonable in terms of what someone could do to their own slave was far below the general, what was generally seen as normal in, let's say, third or fourth or fifth century Constantinople. That's maybe a good comparison.
And Professor, I would like to thank you for your time that you disposed to our Brazilian audience. We have been recording for a little bit more than an hour right now, and was an amazing conversation with someone that is a specialist on the subject. That is, it's open a variety of pointings of view on the same subject. And I would like to invite all my followers on the História Islâmica page to buy the books of Professor Jonathan AC Brown, especially those who talk about this subject of slavery, that is Islam and blackness, and slavery in Islam. It's a very nice, and I have read those books, and they are very well written and amazing stuff. So Alhamdulillah, Professor, I give the time to you to now talk to the audience and make your final considerations.
Well, I mean, I'm happy. I'm really happy to speak to you. It's a part of the world I've never been to, and I've never been to Portugal. I've never been to Brazil, and I don't know Portuguese. And so I'm happy to. I'd really love to meet people from there one day, and I hope Mansur, I hope you send me the link to your page so I can look at it and see what it's like, and see if I can understand anything. And hopefully we'll get to meet in person at some point, inshallah.
Inshallah. Feel welcome. Brazil is a very nice country, and we have a lot of Islamic history here. So thank you, Professor, for your time.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.